A single social media post, published late on a Monday evening, caused the Canadian dollar to collapse to its lowest value in 4 years. Not a market crash, not a financial crisis. 7 words about tariffs, typed and posted, and within minutes the boardrooms of the world's largest corporations were in emergency mode. That is the world we are living in right now, where economic policy is announced through a phone screen, and the consequences are immediate, real, and felt by millions of people who never saw it coming. Donald Trump's announcement of a 25% blanket tariff on all goods crossing into the United States from Canada and Mexico is not a campaign slogan or a negotiating footnote. It is a direct challenge to the economic foundation that has held North America together for the better part of 3 decades. And if you think this is just a story about trade numbers and diplomatic meetings, you are missing the deeper game being played here. One that will reshape the political landscape of the continent, determine the outcome of the 2026 midterm elections, and potentially reorder global alliances in ways that nobody is fully prepared for. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what North America actually is beneath the surface. Most people think of the US-Canada trade relationship as a simple exchange. Canada sends oil and lumber north, America sends manufactured goods south. Everyone shakes hands and goes home. That picture is completely wrong. What actually exists between these two countries is one of the most deeply integrated economic systems on the planet. We are talking about approximately $3.6 billion worth of goods and services crossing that border every single day. That breaks down to roughly $2.5 million every single minute. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including holidays. This is not trade. This is a circulatory system. And the tariff is not a tax on Canadian products. It is a clot. The automotive industry is the clearest example of how this works. A steering wheel manufactured in Ontario gets shipped to a plant in Michigan. The car it goes into gets partially assembled, sent back across the border for additional components, and then returned again for finishing. In some cases, individual parts cross the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor up to 6 times before the finished vehicle rolls off a lot. The entire model was engineered around the assumption of zero tariffs. It was not designed to absorb a 25% friction at every crossing. You add that cost, and the math stops working almost immediately. Not gradually, not slowly, immediately. Assembly lines shut down, workers go home, and the political story writes itself. Now, the stated justification for these tariffs is border security. The incoming administration has explicitly linked trade access to the flow of fentanyl and unauthorized crossings. By grouping Canada and Mexico into the same announcement, they are treating the entire North American trade bloc as a single pressure point, one lever to pull to produce results on the border. But here is where the logic starts to fracture under scrutiny. According to data from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the overwhelming majority of fentanyl precursors originate in China and are processed in Mexico. Canada's contribution to the crisis is real but vastly different in scale. The northern border handles a fundamentally different volume and character of crossings compared to the south. Canada already operates integrated border enforcement teams in direct coordination with U.S. agencies. The problem is that for the incoming administration, coordination is no longer enough. They want results, and they are using the entire trade relationship as collateral to demand them. The energy dimension of this tariff story is the one that should concern Americans most directly, and it is the one receiving the least attention in the coverage. Canada supplies approximately 60% of all crude oil imported into the United States. That is not a rounding error. It is the majority of foreign oil flowing into the American economy, and critically, most of that supply is heavy crude, a specific grade that refineries in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast have been specifically engineered to process. You cannot simply replace Canadian heavy crude with Texas light crude and keep the same output. The infrastructure does not work that way. So when you place a 25% tariff on Canadian oil, you are not punishing Canadian oil companies. You are taxing American refineries, increasing their operating costs, and passing those costs directly to American consumers at the pump. Energy analysts estimate that a 25% tariff could add between 20 and 30 cents to the price of a gallon of gasoline in certain regions almost immediately. For an administration that is promised to lower energy costs as a central policy priority, this is not a minor contradiction. It is a fundamental internal conflict built into the policy itself. The inflation risk is not limited to gasoline. Think about what it takes to build a house in America today. A significant portion of the lumber used in American residential construction comes from Canadian forests. A 25% tariff on that lumber means higher construction costs, which means higher home prices, which means the housing affordability crisis, already one of the sharpest economic pain points for middle-class American voters, gets significantly worse. The same logic applies to automobiles, processed foods, aluminum, paper products, and dozens of other categories that flow across that border every day. The cumulative effect of a blanket tariff this broad is not a targeted surgical strike on foreign competitors. It is a cost of living increase for American households. This brings us to the 2026 midterm elections, and this is where the political gamble embedded in this policy becomes visible. For the past 2 years, the number one issue driving American voter behavior has been the cost of living. Inflation defined the 2022 and 2024 cycles more than almost any other issue. The calculation the current administration appears to be making is that the American public cares more about border security than they do about the price of groceries and gasoline. That may be true, but history suggests it is a bet with serious downside risk. If tariffs are implemented and prices rise measurably in the months before November 2026, the political opposition has a devastatingly simple message ready to deploy. Your life is more expensive because of this trade war, and here is exactly who made that decision. The historical parallels here are instructive but also carry a warning. In 2002, the Bush administration imposed steel tariffs with the stated goal of protecting American steelworkers. The outcome was not what the administration expected. The higher cost of steel hurt far more jobs in the steel-consuming industries, construction, automobile manufacturing, appliance production, than it protected in the steel-producing sector. The World Trade Organization eventually ruled against the United States, and the threat of coordinated European retaliation forced the tariffs to be lifted. After 18 months, the lesson that trade economists draw from that episode is straightforward. Trade wars are far easier to start than they are to win in a way that actually benefits the broader economy. The 2025 situation is the 2002 steel tariff multiplied across every single sector simultaneously, on both borders, with a far more volatile global backdrop. Canada's likely response is already being telegraphed by its political leadership, and it follows a playbook that Ottawa has used before. In 2018, when the first Trump administration imposed steel and aluminum tariffs, Canada retaliated with extraordinary precision. They did not simply respond with tariffs of their own on random American goods. They targeted specific products from specific states represented by key Republican senators and members of Congress: Kentucky bourbon, Wisconsin cheese, Florida orange juice. The message was crafted to land in the right districts at the right moment in the political calendar. If Canada retaliates again in 2025, it will almost certainly deploy the same surgical strategy, timed deliberately to maximize pressure in the 12 months leading into the 2026 midterms. Analysts at the IMF and World Bank have been clear about the broader risk. When the two largest trading partners on the continent go to war economically, the slowdown is not contained to either country. It radiates outward through supply chains, currency markets, and investor confidence globally. Then there is the USMCA factor, which is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of this entire situation. The trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico contains a formal review provision scheduled for 2026. That review was designed to be a deliberate, structured process, a chance to modernize the deal, address new sectors, and strengthen existing protections. By moving to 25% blanket tariffs now, the U.S. is effectively detonating the status quo 2 years ahead of schedule and creating what economists describe as a permanent negotiation environment. For businesses, this is the worst possible context in which to make decisions. Capital investment requires predictability. If a manufacturer does not know whether their cross-border supply chain will be taxed at 0% or 25% next quarter, the rational response is not to adapt. The rational response is to stop investing entirely. An investment freeze in the manufacturing sector of the Rust Belt states, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, is not an abstract concern. It directly affects the communities that have been at the center of the political conversation about economic revitalization for the past decade. What is emerging in response to the tariff pressure is something genuinely new in North American geopolitics: a Canada-Mexico alignment. Historically, The United States has dealt with its two neighbors as separate bilateral relationships, managing each one independently. This tariff announcement, by treating Canada and Mexico as a single unit, has inadvertently pushed them toward each other. The combined GDP of Canada and Mexico represents an economy that is approaching the scale of China's. If they coordinate their trade policy, their retaliation strategy, and their diplomatic outreach in response to U.S. pressure, the power dynamic on the continent shifts in ways that Washington did not intend and may struggle to manage. Beyond the continent, Canada is already moving its diplomatic chess pieces. The CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, connects Canada to 14 other economies across the Pacific Rim. Within hours of the tariff announcement, diplomatic channels were reportedly activated to accelerate the diversification of Canadian trade toward Asian and European markets. Canada's critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, are essential ingredients in the global race for battery technology, semiconductor manufacturing, and the green energy transition. The United States needs those minerals to compete with China in the industries of the future. If a 25% tariff makes Canadian minerals economically impractical to import, the American battery and semiconductor sectors face a direct setback that no amount of domestic drilling or mining can quickly replace. You cannot build a high-tech manufacturing superpower without the raw materials, and right now, the country most capable of supplying those materials at scale is the one being targeted with maximum trade pressure. There are three scenarios that analysts and policymakers are watching as this situation develops. The first is the quick deal. Canada makes significant, visible concessions on border security. The tariff threat is suspended or reduced to a symbolic level, and the maximum pressure tactic is declared a success before it does lasting damage to the integrated economy. The second scenario is the long grind. The tariffs are implemented, both economies begin to slow, businesses freeze investment decisions, and the dispute grinds through the legal and political machinery for years, extending well past the 2026 elections. The third scenario, perhaps the most consequential in the long run, is the breakout. Canada and Mexico deepen their ties with each other and with overseas partners, effectively reorienting their economic gravity away from the United States and toward the broader global market. In this scenario, the U.S. does not necessarily lose the trade war in any immediate sense. It simply discovers, years later, that it has trained its closest neighbors to need it less. There are specific signals worth watching in the weeks ahead that will indicate which of these paths the situation is moving toward. Watch whether the U.S. publishes an exemption list. If energy products are carved out early, it signals that the administration recognizes the domestic inflation risk and is pulling back from the most economically self-destructive elements of the policy. Watch Canada's retaliation list, because the products selected will function as a map of the U.S. congressional districts being targeted for political pressure. And watch Canada's border investment announcements. If Ottawa begins announcing major new expenditures in border technology and enforcement, it is a signal that Canada believes it can buy its way out of the tariff threat by delivering visible results that Washington can hold up as a win. What this moment ultimately represents is a fundamental argument about where prosperity comes from. For 30 years, the governing assumption of North American economic policy was that open borders and integrated supply chains were the engine of growth. That making it cheap and fast to move goods across the continent created more wealth for everyone than any individual country could generate alone. That assumption is now being explicitly challenged. The new argument is that security, sovereignty, and domestic control of supply chains are worth paying a higher economic price for. That the integration dividend was real, but the security cost was hidden, and it is time to rebalance the equation. That debate is legitimate. The question of how much economic efficiency is worth trading for national security is one of the most important policy questions of the current era, and there are serious arguments on both sides. But the debate needs to happen clearly, with full accounting of the costs, including the cost to American consumers at the gas pump, the cost to American workers in auto plants, the cost to American families trying to buy homes in an already brutal housing market. When those costs are hidden inside the language of maximum pressure and border security, the public cannot make an informed judgment about whether the trade-off is worth it. The North American economy is the most successful trading relationship in modern history. The border between the United States and Canada is the busiest in the world, and it has been managed for the most part as a partnership rather than a confrontation. That relationship is now under a pressure that has no modern precedent in scale or scope. Whether it emerges from this period stronger, restructured, or fundamentally fractured is the defining economic and geopolitical question of the next 2 years. The machinery keeps running for now, the goods keep moving, but the rules governing that movement have been thrown into question. And until those questions are answered, every business, every investor, and every family with a stake in the North American economy is operating in a new and more uncertain world.